to expect someone who is, let's say, the COO to be completely well versed in every single country's local laws and the fact that the laws constantly change is an impossible assumption.
You're listening to the Global Workforce Podcast with me, George Britton. Each week, we interview an industry expert to dive deeper into the world of managing a global workforce and discuss the big strategic challenges that you're going to encounter along the way. This episode is brought to you by Omnipresent, the global employment platform that allows you to employ anyone, anywhere without having to set up an entity. Designed, built, and supported by global employment experts, Omnipresent takes care of your international employees and contractors, so you don't have to worry about payroll, HR, or compliance issues, making it easier, faster, and safer to expand internationally. My guest today is Michele Museyri. Michele joined HSP Group in 2021 and is the Director of Private Equity and M&A, and she specializes in the formation of compliant and strategic international operations for high-growth companies and cross-border carve-outs. Michele has 15 years of experience supporting companies as they expand their international footprint from both organic growth and M&A activity. And she's been at the forefront of advising clients on the legal and regulatory considerations critical to successful M&A activities. Her deep understanding of global business dynamics and her commitment to strategic solutions makes her a trusted advisor in the challenging landscape of international expansion. Michele, welcome to the Global Workforce Podcast.
Thank you, George. Nice to be here.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here. So, Michele, let's jump straight in. M&A is often viewed as a strategic tool for companies to expand globally. In your mind, what makes it such a powerful strategy for businesses looking to go internationally?
So you could have, a U.S. company that's saturated the market in the U.S. They're looking for new opportunities, or maybe they're doing very well, but there's a big market for them somewhere else. There could be supply chain reasons, like we saw, all across 2020 to 2023, and still a little bit into today with COVID. Where a company may get shut down in one market and needs to start to diversify their supply chain. So, you have intentional growth through M&A that can be really strategic for companies, but you also have M&A that may not even be an intentional way to expand into a country. So, perhaps you have a large European company that acquires another European company, but it just so happens that that company has locations in Brazil. And so now suddenly you find yourself part of a strategic acquisition, but now you have employees, assets in Latin America, and you have to find a way to maximize it.
Yeah, interesting. So it sounds like there's a huge range of different reasons why companies might grow through M&A. Like you say, they could have saturated one market, they could be acquiring a competitor in a different market, or they could just be acquiring a company with like assets in other countries that they might not have foreseen earlier on, right?
And maybe they see that, things are going well, but suddenly they look around, their competition, in the US or in another market is growing into, Asia. And they realize that in order to keep up with the competition, they're going to have to do the same. And so they start, trying to figure out, okay, do we want to grow organically? Do we want to look for, let's say, an Asian headquarter? Is that going to be Singapore? How do we make that decision? Do we want to just try one country, dip our toe into this international expansion and give it a whirl? Or do you want to take over a business that's already successful and we can just, add that to our portfolio?
Yeah, exactly. I guess that's one of the key considerations, right? It's like, do we try and do it ourselves and be the brand in that place, or do we just acquire someone who's already been there and done it and just, and yeah, it's more expensive, but you buy the book of business, you buy the footprint, you buy everything else along with that, right?
Exactly.
Cool. So I guess when companies are going through these kind of transactions, there's various different ways they might employ people. One being through entities, another is through employer record. You've got a fair amount of experience with employer record. Like, how do you see that fitting into the M&A process?
So employer record can be a very masterful tool to use when you're expanding internationally, whether, it is organic or through an acquisition. There's a lot of reasons why companies will use it, whether it's short-term as an interim solution or using it as a long-term strategy. Usually this decision is made not just by the business heads, but also together with their attorneys, because there are legal reasons why an employer record would or would not be a good choice. So you have this concept called permanent establishment that I know, you, George, obviously know better than most people in the market. But, for people who are listening in, you have permanent establishment, which is just this taxable presence that you can create by doing business in another country. And the threshold for that varies extensively by country. And so you may have the Netherlands versus Mexico that may decide, if you have someone who is a senior position, someone like the COO based in a country, you've suddenly hit a permanent establishment threshold. Or now that country is going to make sure that you as a company are paying taxes on your revenue so that they can get a piece of that business. So once you've triggered something like a permanent establishment in a country, you may or may not be able to do employer of record. And so sometimes that threshold can be by having more than 5 employees or certain sorts of business contracts that you may be generating. But when it is decided between the business leaders and the attorneys that all agree that employer of record can be, is possible from a legal perspective, it can be a very essential tool by saying, we want to go into this country. We're not really sure we want to have a legal presence yet. Maybe we're just determining from a business development perspective, we're going to put, someone there to do market research to see, is this a place where we want to grow our business? Do we think that we're going to be successful here? You want to try it for a few years, and you can then employ someone to a third party like Omnipresent, employ someone to their legal entity in that country. So by doing that, you avoid having to incorporate a legal entity, registering for taxes yourself, setting up your own local bank account, and doing all of the back office that's required once you do have a legal entity. So things like legal filing, like doing your accounting in local GAAP. There's so many tasks that you will be required to do once you have a legal entity. So having an employer of record set up allows you to say, there's a resource in that country, whether it's an engineer in Romania or whether it's, a business development, associate in China, and you want to say, I want to give it a try for a few years and see if this is really a model that I want to pursue. And perhaps I don't even need a legal entity in the long run because of the type of business activities that I'm doing in that country.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And I think you've touched on a few interesting points there. Permanent establishment risk is, I guess, one of the most common conversations that we end up having with people and telling them not giving them advice, but giving them a bit of a steer as to what to look out for. What kind of things do you tend to help clients to look out for? You mentioned senior people having a COO and maybe 5 employees in a certain country. Is there anything else that you would typically raise as a concern and say, hey, you want to check with your attorneys about this one?
Yeah, if you have a lot of them, let's say sales employees who are signing contracts locally, so someone in country signing a contract with a local company, if you have employees that are gaining commissions from their business, these are pretty easy flags to a country that would say, looks like you guys are doing pretty well. You're making business here. We want a piece of the action. And so, by having a larger force of, employee force, by having a lot of commission that's clearly recognizable as being profitable because of the individuals in that country, senior staff, those are really the biggest tells.
Yeah, understood. And then the other thing you mentioned is testing out different markets. Maybe you want to hire an engineer or one person you want to try a new market out and see if that's a good fit for you. I guess the other thing that's on my mind is in the context of a merger and acquisition or in a carve-out, how do you help clients determine if they should be going for an entity or an employer of record? Or, how do you help them make those decisions?
Yeah, this is a conversation that we have continuously with clients, and usually one that has to be made quite quickly because getting a legal entity set up in many countries can take many months. There's locations like the UK where, in a week, 2 weeks max, you can have, an entity set up, just go online, fill out the paperwork, easy peasy. But you look at countries like China, the United Arab Emirates, and 9 months is a standard average amount of time that it could take to get an entity set up. And so if you're engaging in an acquisition, and specifically if it's going to be a carve out where you have to, and the entities aren't conveying, and you have to set up your future operational business net new, you're going to be required to think about how much time do I have, whether it's under the TSA or during the deal negotiations, how much time do I have before I need to have an entity that's operational, ready to transfer the assets, the employees, into it and already be ready with locally compliant employment contracts, a local bank account, all of my taxes and employer registrations done so that I can start my business. Because you won't have the luxury of having the deal signed and then having the deal close, and then from there taking a few months to get things ready. I mean, only under a TSA would you have that flexibility. So we see it many times where the lawyers will say, in these locations, we feel, based on the risk, assessment that this is going to be acceptable in these countries. And so we would then say, okay, if you don't have a TSA that's going to be long enough, if you don't want to pay for the TSA, and you need these employees, and business is moving faster than you would expect in other circumstances, usually in M&A, in acquisitions, you would then say, okay, we can put these individuals under employer of record. And in doing so, we could say, we're going to have them under a short period of time until the entity is set up, and then we'll transfer them into the future entity.
Yeah, makes total sense. Sounds like quite a complicated matrix of things to factor in, like what's the timeline on the deal, how complex is the country, and how long did it take to set up an entity, how many employees are there, is there a permanent establishment risk? So clearly you need some expertise to help you through some of those challenges.
One of the biggest factors that really gets, I think, forgotten about or neglected really until the 11th hour, which is so crucial for people to be considering, is the issue of the benefits that the employees already have. I know this is a topic that you're probably very passionate about. We are as well at HSP, because we see it implode for our clients day in and day out. So one of the things that really the decision makers, let's say on the buy side, for the client, neglect to put at the forefront of all of their decision making is what benefits and what supplemental benefits do the employees have? What conditions, what terms under their employment contracts, written and agreed to, outside of their employment contract, do they have that we will be under local employment law required to replicate in order to keep these employees whole? In the UK, you have 2-pay laws, you have ARD. Across Europe, you have equivalent laws in most countries around the world. And so it's one of the most challenging activities to first obtain the information from the seller, because a lot of the information won't be known until the 11th hour for many reasons. Reviewing all of those activities and saying, what are the benefits? What else do these employees have? And when you're carving out employees from a larger workforce, it's important to understand, are these employees part of a works council? Do these employees have collective labor or collective bargaining agreements? What unions might they be a part of? In some countries, let's say the Netherlands, if you have over 50 employees, there's going to be a works council. Now, if you have in your acquisition, you have 8 employees coming out from the Netherlands, it might not even occur to you that there could be a works council. If they were part of a larger business unit with many more employees, that's going to have a big impact, not only on the types of benefits that they would have had, but on how to negotiate and get everyone to agree to what future benefits you'll replicate. And with regard to employer of record, those types of benefits can be more challenging to replicate under an employer of record if it's not structured correctly, and if your employer of record is not as familiar with those sorts of activities.
Yeah, 100%. I'm smiling because, as you mentioned benefits, I'm thinking of Emma, who runs our benefits team. As soon as she gets wind of a carve-out or something like that, she's like all over it. Like, come on, we need benefits, we need benefits, we need benefits. Right. So we need to know ahead of time, like, how we're going to make the transfer, right?
One of the most difficult benefits, and it sounds very silly, but the most difficult benefit that we find to try and replicate in a carve-out is car leases for employees. Whether it's Argentina, Europe, anywhere in Asia, working with a car leasing company, and it's very common in Europe for employees to be given company cars. And so when you try to explain to an employee who may have been employed by their former employer for 25 years, they've had a car, that they're now going to be given a stipend on a monthly basis to go out, negotiate a car lease, deal with all of the issues that, happen to cars on, however often a year, that's something that is going to create a lot of aggravation. And if they're part of a works council, you may have a very difficult time getting them to agree to that.
100%. So, Michele, let me ask you another question. If a company knows they're going down this route for M&A, like how do they make themselves M&A ready? What kind of things should they be thinking about?
So depending on the size of the company, there will be different considerations. So if you have, let's say you're a bigger company, you may be using Workday for HR, SAP for finance. Now you'll need everything from that new market to flow into what you already do. And that's going to require technology integration. It's going to require a lot of thought for how to separate data and create a plan for that for the amount of time that's going to take for that integration. So what you'll do in the immediate term, the short term, and then eventually once all the information flows. But that can create massive complexities. Now, on the flip side, depending on how important the acquisition may be, if you're a large organization too, you may or may not get the attention from senior management. Perhaps this is a company that does serial acquisition. And so it may not have the bigger focus. And so you may need even more help on the ground, making sure you have the right partners in place to advise you. If you don't have people in senior management who have done this time and time again and are also giving you the attention. In smaller companies, there's, a lot of benefit in having everyone's focus and attention on this, but there's usually a lot riding on that decision. So if you're a smaller company and it's your first time going into a new market, you really need to make sure that you have the company's full attention, that you have good people surrounding you to help you achieve your goals.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And what are some of the things that people often overlook? You mentioned kind of like in the context of benefits. Car leases is one thing that's often a real problem. You mentioned things like systems like Workday. I'm guessing when you're going through, you have companies making these international acquisitions. All of a sudden, as they do that, they're all of a sudden inheriting new data protection laws and things like that, right? Are there any kind of other stumbling blocks or speed bumps that people often overlook?
Yes. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of naivety around what it takes to be compliant in other countries. So, you have companies in the US who are not familiar with GDPR laws and the UK version of GDPR law, so data privacy and protection, which, really you can't be too big or too small, to get dinged by the local authorities for not complying with these laws. You have issues like health and safety that, and medical checks that it would never occur to many companies to know that you have to not only register in advance for your employees to be set up properly, but also there's additional licenses, certifications, and time that it takes to get set up. And so the most important thing that a company can do is start planning as early as possible. And I think one of the pitfalls that we see with companies all too frequently is that finance is focused on finance and they're thinking about the accounting systems. Tax, it's kind of an afterthought, which can be a stumbling block because you may have nil tax filings that come due immediately upon incorporating an entity in some countries, which you would have to file even if you're not operational yet. And on the flip side, you have, let's say, the CHRO, who may be the only person who at the executive level who's thinking about the employee transfer and getting the employee set up, which can be, which the implications of getting that wrong are going to implode much earlier than any of the accounting system setup.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. So like you said before, it's important to get all of the leadership team aware of like all of the key aspects going into some of these transactions, right? And let's talk a bit about due diligence. You've highlighted the importance of due diligence in managing workforce complexities during M&A deals. Can you share some of the best practices that you often share with people around that companies should adopt during this phase?
Yeah. So during the due diligence phase, one of the most important things is starting to try and get as much information as early as possible. This is traditionally very difficult. Oftentimes, sellers are quite nervous to overshare, and give too much information because, whether it may affect the value of the deal, or what have you, but the buyer asking the right questions, having someone advising them about the international complexity components early on so they can start trying to get as much information as they can. Even if you can't get everything, it's important to start asking those questions, get as much as you can so that you can start at least preparing for the unknown by understanding that there may be employees based in countries, whether they're working remotely, that you could have, global mobility impacts. You could have employees from one country who are working or have been working remotely from somewhere else. You could have people who are listed as contractors, and not actually employees, which we see this very frequently when they are, mislabeled and misemployed as a contractor versus an employee, which could create problems, for the new employer, the buyer. And so understanding, you know, the breadth of the business internationally, where the employees are based, how they're hired, how they've been contracted, trying to really get to the bottom of, quickly what the future setup will look like. So many times it's not quite determined until later in the due diligence. Will we be acquiring the entities with us, or will we be setting this up net new? That has massive impacts about in the amount of time it can take to become operational. So there's a lot riding on information, and it's important to have, you know, I would say, a table of your closest strategic partners from the legal side. Obviously you need and your accountants, but also people who have deep expertise in international expansion to be reviewing the purchase agreement, to be involved in the TSA negotiations to make sure that we don't have these really critical gaps.
Yeah, 100%. I totally agree with you on getting as much of the information out there as early as possible. Like, I've been in due diligence processes where it's almost like a Russian doll. Like, you answer one question, and then overnight the auditors then come back with 10 more questions about that original question, and then you go into each of those, and there's another 5 on each of those different things. So yeah, getting ahead of
Correct.
it and making sure that you don't end up slowing things down at the last minute, I think is a big focus.
And I think there is, just a level of normal, support that any company would need. I mean, you could be Microsoft, but to expect someone, who is, let's say, the COO to be completely well versed in every single country's local laws, and the fact that the laws constantly change, is an impossible assumption. And so, understanding that in a country like Germany, where you have work councils that have co-determination right, who have the power to completely block the transfer from closing if they're not satisfied with an agreement. It's really important to understand early on if there's going to be employees in Germany, and understand if there could be, we see deals where there's one employee in France, and you have to think to yourself, what are we going to do? What is the company going to do about the one employee in France? What is the price to transfer that employee over, to include France in that deal, and to work to replicate the employee's benefits, keep that employee on. And if things don't work out, the amount of time and cost it would take to wind that down in a country like France. These are all really critical factors to really be able to paint the total cost, the risks, and the future outcome for this particular deal.
Yeah, it's really interesting you mentioned that. So what I wanted to ask you about was kind of the rise that I've certainly seen of multinational carve-outs, and that being quite a popular, I guess, transaction that seems to be picking up a bit of steam in the last few years. I guess because more and more companies are becoming global compared to, let's say, 50 years ago. But that also then, carve-outs then becoming global. What's in your mind, what makes cross-border carve-outs like such an effective or an attractive option for businesses nowadays?
I think it's really on both sides. I mean, you have the sellers where a carve out is a really interesting opportunity for them too. I mean, they may have gone through changes in the organization where they say, we now really want to focus on this part of our organization, and we don't want to keep doing, something else that we've had, and it perhaps not as profitable, or there's a change in the company strategy, and being able to sell that off can be massively profitable for them. Um, you know, in other cases, you have people that are simply retiring, and it's a family business, and it's time for them to, figure out a plan if their children don't want to take over. Um, but on the buy side, companies that, are in manufacturing, we have, obviously now we're seeing, an explosion of AI. It's going to be a huge theme for this year, next year, who knows, all of the years to come. And so building of data centers, and electricity plants is going to become something that's going to be top of mind for many organizations. And so being able to start by getting into a field that is tangential to what it is that your company is selling, and that sort of growth and being able to jump off of someone else's the beginning of their book of business and take that to the next level is obviously a very enticing business opportunity for many companies to grow into markets on the industry side and country side.
Mm. Yeah, that's super interesting. I guess to wrap a few of these things together, carve-outs can be a really interesting, a really exciting way to kind of like take a business forward in various means. But I guess to bring in your other point, like there also can be, especially as more and more companies are becoming global, you then might inherit some various complexities there. So what are some of the challenges you see in some of these cross-border carve-out deals?
So we have the employee side, which, plenty of complexities, and we've already started talking about that. But I think it's also important to talk about the local requirements in countries, maybe outside of the HR and payroll side. So if you think about, every country has their own set of laws. When you look at countries like Canada, Australia, Brazil that have provinces, states, you're not just dealing with the laws of a country. You're dealing with the local, variances and nuances of each of the different locations based on where you're doing business, where the employees happen to be located, changing laws that will affect that. We see, for example, in China, if you happen to have, and this is something we see very often, it's very interesting because when you're doing a carve out, typically, but once we would get involved, there's usually already an accountant, there's a lawyer, there may be, other consultants involved, there could be global providers for different activities. But usually what's missing is someone who has the bird's eye view that can really understand the interdependencies of all of the services. So people think, well, finance is with finance, payrolls with payroll, legal is with legal, but there are pieces of this that are so critical for people to understand how one business decision affects the other. So as an example, in China, and we've seen this many times, you have a company that is taking over a business that has employees based in Shanghai. And so the company is going through the steps of incorporating a business in Shanghai, and they're getting, set up their tax registration. They have to have a series of banking complexities they have to supersede, like having a bank and then a local bank to make their statutory payments. Then we learn to find out that there are actually employees based in other provinces in China. Now, that's particularly complicated in China because that means that you're not only required to incorporate in the headquartered location where you want to in China, but you are mandated to actually open up a branch in each of the provinces where employees are based. And if you are now moving from having one entity in Shanghai and now you have 3 additional branches in 3 additional provinces, the amount of requirements from a legal perspective, the amount of work from a bookkeeping, filing taxes, all of the HR benefits that has to get done, everything has just been multiplied. And so you have your cost structure is wrong. The amount of effort you expect to be done is wrong, and you have to reevaluate that. You have countries like Brazil that have taxes are broken up from the federal to the state to the municipal, which may not surprise a lot of companies. But there are over 5,000 municipalities within the Brazilian borders. So each one of those, I mean, I think it's over 5,500. I mean, each one of those has their own set of tax regulations and calculations that you would have to have local experts make sure that they understand so that, if you're operating in multiple cities in Brazil, you would require to have, extreme attention to detail to all of this to make sure that you are operating correctly, filing your taxes correctly as well. So there's so many intricate nuances in every part of the company that are going to affect how successful you can be and what your costs are going to be. So that research in advance to make sure that you really want to go into that country is important. And that's actually why employer of record can be such a powerful tool, because you can say, okay, I don't know all of the laws in Brazil, or I'm not completely familiar with how things are done in China, but we think it's going to be a really valuable place for us to do business. Let's make sure our lawyers say it's okay for employer of record. And then let's try and put a few people in those countries. Let's give it a year or two. We'll learn things also organically. We'll get the advice from our strategic partners, and then we'll see if it actually makes sense to set up a legal presence there.
Yeah, 100%. And I guess I had someone on the podcast a couple of weeks ago that was talking about the UAE, because that's effectively like you've got Abu Dhabi, you've got Dubai, and then you've got the state laws, and they're all completely different. They all have
Oh,
different
yeah.
like appeal processes and everything else in between, even different languages that govern the laws and things like that. So
Even the way that businesses operate, so
mm,
going in and trying to operate business like you would in the United States, in the UAE is going to come in for a very rude awakening. A lot of business is done in person, over tea, over coffee, and it's in order to get business deals done, and in order to just get general paperwork completed properly, there's a lot of local nuances, and it's important to have boots on the ground, people that have those existing relationships to help you with that.
mm. And then setting up a company and then a bunch of subsidiaries in mainland China sounds scary when you're trying to get a big deal done. And you've got, especially if you're doing one with like, you've got like 20 different countries with employees in, and then you get to that point where you mentioned like, maybe you actually set up entities in these 5 countries, but the others where we only have less than 5 employees, like let's simplify this and let's use an employer of record. But I guess that comes to my next question, which is what should businesses be thinking about when they're trying to go through these deals? Maybe they've only got a few weeks before they're trying to close the deal out. They're finding out these complexities, things are unraveling, and they're finding, they ask a question, they get more answers, and they ask more questions based on those answers. Like, what kind of steps can people take to ensure they're being compliant, but also make sure to get things done on time?
Yes. It's a great question because sometimes we come into a hair and fire scenarios that, at that point, it's really a rush to the finish line. But, in most scenarios, it is going to be, you'll have 4 weeks left before the deal closes. And suddenly, the questions that you're asking, like you said, are creating more questions and more concern, and people are becoming appropriately worried and anxious about how they're going to get this done. Really, I mean, I can't stress it enough. Having, partners in place who have done this before, who have the local knowledge and who have local presence to get the work done is important. I think it's really an unfair task to anyone in a company to try to take this on by themselves, especially when there's more than 2 or 3 countries involved in this acquisition. It's really important to not only be thinking about the employees getting transferred properly, the entities getting set up or having, the different entity changes made if you're going to be, taking over entities, but also looking at the timelines. And so it's important to have, someone advising you who can map out for you how long is it really going to take, aggressively and conservatively, taking into account, August in Europe, the Chinese New Year in Asia, things shutting down, because of COVID, and other, and presidential elections, and how that creates a paper backlog. So the most important thing is having, partners with you that are going to be also assessing the overarching plan, getting everything set up on time, getting the employees transferred, getting your entities operational, and really the first 12 to 18 months, what's your plan? Because after the 18 months, by that point, you'll be ready to assess, whether you're going to be remaining in some countries, if you're going to have a regional, if you're going to have regional support overseeing these teams. But it's expected that for the first 12 to 18 months, you're going to need outside support.
Yeah, 100%. I think you're right. It's there's no real shortcut to that. It's like, do you have people who know this market and who have the expertise? Just the easiest way to navigate it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about banking and KYC laws. Obviously, this must be a challenge for people going through these kind of carve-out situations. What are some of the, we've certainly seen situations where, people are trying to get their ducks in a row before the actual closure of the deal. And then as things get transferred, you then got a load of different KYC checks and things.
Mm-hmm.
How do you help people navigate some of those complexities?
Yeah, a lot of these KYC challenges come up in getting a local bank account set up. There are a lot of, there are some workarounds for local bank accounts, especially, short term. There's, companies that will help you, whether it's trust account, or they may have their own global banking system to really help facilitate making statutory payments on your behalf initially until your bank account may be set up. It could take, something like 4 months in somewhere like India or Mexico to get a local bank account. And in other countries, it's a requirement to have a local bank account set up as part of the incorporation process. So that really can elongate timelines. So for KYC, a lot of what we'll be doing is what we do for our clients is really providing them a list and saying these are all the documents that you have to already start preparing for that you will need from a KYC, anti-money laundering, AML perspective. That can range from passport copies of directors, which that means you actually have to already identify who are going to be your future directors and make sure you're already on your path to getting D&O insurance, which is a process as well. So getting passport copies of those. One of the things I think is the most challenging to get done quite quickly is the org structure chart. And so already identifying, what that org structure chart looks like for all of your future entities that are coming over or that are going to be incorporated as a result of the acquisition. So getting all the documents prepared, there's usually, and especially in a country like the UAE, you have multiple stages where the documents have to be notarized, apostille stamped, wet signatures. They have to go to different government agencies for sign off and for review. And so having, individuals who understand the importance of getting that done early and quickly can save massive amounts of time.
Got you. And then once the entity's set up, I guess companies will then face ongoing tasks like managing tax liabilities, payroll, HR. How can they ensure that these processes are kind of like operational from the get-go?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Again, it's really about getting started early, which may sound, difficult to hear because usually time is of the essence. So it can be just about moving quickly, and understanding, that taking the task seriously as soon as they're communicated. You have things like all the different registrations that have to get done. Many of these things can happen in parallel, and so it's important that the person, the team that you're working with is explaining to you how to accelerate a lot of these tasks. In countries you have, while you're incorporating the entity, but in order to maybe perhaps do the tax registrations, get the local bank account set up, and a series of other things, maybe you need your VAT number. And perhaps that comes earlier before the entity is finished being incorporated, or there's different pieces of that can start earlier. And so it's important to make sure that you have, experts in the industry, in the country, who are helping you go through that. There's countries like China and the UAE that require you to actually obtain a physical lease agreement to register in a specific office spaces that are sanctioned for entity incorporation as part of the incorporation process. So just really having all of the tasks required mapped out, and the timelines associated with it and how to accelerate each piece is going to be very important.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And that's where that local expertise comes in as well. Michele, I know we've got a load out of this podcast. If I just have a couple more questions before we wrap up, and I'll let you go. I guess one of the things that I often see is you've got competing stakeholders in some of these deals. You might have buyer saying one thing, seller side saying something else. You've got independent advisors kind of all sticking their opinion in. How should people think about getting like a single source of truth and overcoming some of these situations where you've got competing opinions?
That's hard. That's hard to answer, because I think it depends on a lot of relationships that companies, pre-existing relationships that companies have. What I would say is that there should be a grain of salt taken with the advice from the strategic partners that are looking really with a more of a narrow focus. For example, if you are talking to, your attorney, but your attorney also has plenty of experience with employment law, it's still important to make sure that if the attorney you're speaking to is U.S. focused or UK focused, UK based, do they also have their partners in other countries that they are conferring with, and are they getting the global view? Same with the accountant. I think it's important to listen to all of your strategic partners, to hear what they're saying, and then really ask the people who work in international expansion if they have any comments, if there's any, of these interdependencies, any reason why what one person is saying might change based on information that's coming from, let's say, from the payroll side, from the employee side. It's really important to have them working together if you're working with multiple strategic partners. Sometimes, especially with smaller organizations, they're not working with, 4 different partners. They don't have someone from the Big Four and someone else from the Big Four and someone from the consulting firm. And they have their one international expansion team helping them. That's going to be doing a lot of the back office work. And so that makes it a lot easier. So it's just really important that there is at least someone who is looking at the overarching timelines, local compliance requirements, and how the different, sectors are interacting with one another.
Yeah, it makes total sense. Michelle, I've taken away a lot from this conversation. For me, I think one of the key takeaways is getting information out up front. Just put a little thumbs up on the video. What I mean to do. Getting as much information out up front so you can prepare for all of the different eventualities that might come up later down the line with the acquisition. Speaking to the right experts that aren't just experts in a siloed field, but also coordinating all those experts across all the different internal functions of the business, but also across all the different regions and all the different kind of disciplines that might be involved in the acquisition. So yeah, I think those were some of the common themes. Before I pass back to you, I wanted to get your perspective. You mentioned kind of like political changes and things like that. And I guess since I've been doing this podcast for 9 months or so, I feel like every other week there's a new political change that seems to affect things, and now people think one thing and another thing. Let me put you on the spot here. What are your predictions for 2025? What do you think is going to happen now? We're recording this in early January, so we'll definitely hold you to this later in the year when it's not quite right. What does the outlook look like for you in terms of the M&A markets for?
I'm very bullish. To be frank, I think we can expect to see, significantly improved economic conditions, supportive regulatory environments, a strong pipeline of innovative startups, especially in healthcare and life sciences. I think we're going to be a strong part of that activity. We have AI on the forefront of every business strategy, data centers, electricity generators. I expect to see a lot of growth in U.S. companies into countries that offer, offer land, offer good opportunities for that industry as well. I would also say, we saw a lot of this during COVID times, and right before as well. We saw a lot of technology-driven acquisitions, but I think now we'll see a lot that include AI that will drive the growth. Tech companies tend to do very well in M&A because they're usually cash rich, whether they're VC backed, or otherwise, and they have a lot less due diligence on the ground. So if you acquire something that doesn't have a factory or physical presence, there's a lot less that you have to be worried about. So I think that's going to be a market that really ticks up again during this coming administration. We don't know what's going to happen with U.S. trade policies regarding tariffs, but that could add a layer of complexity, and it could significantly impact the global economy and M&A activity. So I think we'll have to see how that plays out. I'm sure everyone's quite interested to see what takes place and how quickly.
Amazing. So yeah, positive outlook, which is let's hope you're right.
Yes.
Fantastic. Michelle, thank you so much for being my guest on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me.